Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, Oxfam has released its annual report on rising inequality, expressing concern that billionaires are not only wealthier than ever, but are also cementing their control over politics, media, and social media. The report released over this past weekend also underscored the widening chasm between the haves and the have-nots in a world beset by conflicts and multiplying protests. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Amir Rioromi, who is the Media and Campaign Officer at Oxfam South Africa. Amir, assalamu alaikum. Always good having you on. Shukran for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam. It's good to be here.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Amir, this report, and it was quite detailed in really showing why the world is as unequal as it has ever been. We see a handful of individuals who are completely wealthy, especially within the global north, while the poorest half of humanity, ironically sitting within the global south, struggles to survive. How important was the compilation of this, given that we are in the week of the World Economic Forum?
Yeah, thank you so much for such a great question. I think the most important part of this message for everybody to take away is that what we are seeing is something that is fundamentally broken, and that's the current economic system. You know, we are not talking about a system that isn't producing wealth. We know that it is, but it is producing it for a very small group of people, while billions are struggling to get by. You know, when billionaires' wealth grows at record speed in the same year that food insecurity and poverty are rising, that's not a coincidence. You know, it means that the rules of economy are rigged. It means that, you know, they reward ownership of asset far more than work, far more than care, or even contribution to society. And what people need to understand that this is the result of policy choices. They're not accidental.
Amir, my next question is going to be probably centered around one person, and he's the most talked about person in global politics. That's none other than Donald Trump, because what this report highlighted is that these billionaires are roughly 4,000 times more likely to hold political office than an ordinary citizen. I think it's important for the viewer to digest the number of 4,000 times likely. And this comes at a time where you've got Donald Trump saying, we want to acquire Greenland and we want to shape the way the global order is with the so-called Board of Peace. And it begs the question with regards to democracy, how much of it is it under threat because of this right now?
Yeah, fantastic point. You know, I think we need to be honest, and you know, to give you a short answer, yes, it is a serious threat to democracy. When wealth becomes concentrated, you know, for us, it doesn't stay in the economy, it doesn't get circulated, it moves into politics. And, you know, billionaires have far more greater access to power, like we say in the report, 4,000 times more likely. Whether it is through political, you know, office or campaign financing or behind the scene influence, it doesn't matter. The point is that they do have influence. And, you know, people feel that decisions are being made for the wealthy, not the majority. And the trust in democracy during these times erodes. So we are seeing that play out in many countries right now. And we really have to be cautious as South Africans to make sure that doesn't happen here.
I mean, we can't look far from home also. We've got a president who's also a billionaire, who's the president of this country. So I guess, I mean, it would be a bit sort of unfair of us to, of course, have this conversation of Donald Trump, while in our country we have something similar right here. I guess the follow-up to that, Amir, is that the sort of policies that billionaires would come with in terms of their ideologies and ultimately it become legislated. Is there a cause for concern there also at the same time? Because at the end of the day, by its nature, billionaires are capitalists, and capitalists think of one thing and one thing only, and that is really their respective profits.
Right. No, it's absolutely a major area of concern. We know that, again, let's not look far. Let's look at home. We know that a number of South African billionaires, a handful of them, they publicly have announced that they do political funding in this country. And their political funding is not necessarily targeted to one a particular political party, but a wide range of political party, which to me, again, indirectly is a sign of that willingness or that desire to have influence across the political board, regardless of political ideology or political branding. So when it comes to, parliament or, pushing a particular policy, they know that they at least have certain level of influence due to previous political funding. So it is a major area of concern, especially in a year that we have local elections coming up.
Amir, within this report, it was highlighted that billionaires now control a large share of media and social media platforms. Now, it took me to a famous Bond motion picture called Tomorrow Never Dies, where there was an individual, Elliot Carver, who was able to manipulate stories at that time. We are now living it in real life, aren't we, given what we have seen in this report? When it comes to media, when it comes to the distribution of news, how much of a concern is there that you've got these individuals buying news organizations, and hence, of course, the sort of information and the production of information and how it is distributed to the public?
Yeah, once again, a major area of concern because, media ownership shapes what we talk about and what we don't talk about. When a small number of extremely wealthy people control major media and social media platform, it affects, the voices that are amplified and which voices are sidelined. So issues like inequality, poverty, or workers' rights often struggle to get sustained attention. And these kind of divisive and sensational content that we often see on social media spreads far more easier, the clickbaits that we all kind of encounter from time to time. So that has real consequence for public debate and accountability and censoring as well. So again, the reports highlights that as a major area of concern because we know that over 50% of all media and mass majority of social media are owned by the same billionaires as well.
And of course, not forgetting X, which is of course owned by South Africa's very own Elon Musk. Amir, one final question before we go to the break. This question, of course, comes at a time where we've seen the sort of merger of one of the US's biggest media organizations, CBS News. And why I ask this question with regards to the media environment dominated by ultra-wealthy owners producing unbiased reporting, because Dave Ellison, of course, has led this merger between Paramount Skydance and, of course, Viacom CBS. You've got Barry Wise, who is the editor-in-chief, and both Wise and Ellison are very close to the Israeli government, who has been found to have committed genocide in Gaza. And they're very close to US President Donald Trump. How are we in terms of this sort of unbiased reporting, especially when it comes to what we see in Gaza right now, even though we're on the second phase of the ceasefire?
Right. Look, I don't want to say that to be able to produce unbiased news is impossible, especially if mass majority of the owners are ultra wealthy. But I can tell you that it is extremely, extremely difficult to be unbiased because there's an obvious conflict of interest, particularly around ownership and political ideology. So this isn't about, blaming journalists, and we have to be very clear with that, because oftentimes journalists do come under fire for this. So it's not about blaming them. I think many of them do excellent excellent work under tough conditions, right? And we just have to be aware that structurally, it's hard to have open, honest debates about extreme wealth, or taxing, extreme wealth, or regulating corporate power, when the people who would be the most affected own the platforms, really, So over time, I think the conversation shifts away from systematic solution and towards blaming individuals and communities instead. And I would like for people to rather avoid that and always look at the ownership and what their interest is, and not necessarily the people that like work in those environments.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Amir. We're going to be touching on where we are right now in terms of the influence billionaires have on so many aspects of society. This, as the World Economic Forum, I beg your pardon, takes center stage. Do stay tuned to News in Focus. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Amir Baghe-Rioromi, who is the Media and Campaign Officer for Oxfam South Africa. Now, I know, Amir, last year, heading into, of course, the G20 summit, Oxfam had this campaign called, Tax the Super Rich. And, reading the report that was, of course, published over the weekend, billionaires' wealth grew 3 times faster last year than in the recent past. And I guess that just shows sort of the global inequality widening. Right. What do countries need to do in terms of existing tax and regulatory systems? Because, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, the government's going to say, well, we can't really tax the super rich because we need the investments, but, we'll go ahead and tax the ordinary citizen. I guess your inequality starts there, doesn't it?
It definitely does, and it goes back to what I was saying. Our current economic system rewards wealth and assets more than work and care and contributing equally, and that is fundamentally the wrong way of looking at economy. I think our existing tax and regulatory systems genuinely fail ordinary citizens. What we see is ordinary people are paying taxes on their wages, while extreme wealth often goes lightly taxed or untaxed altogether. At the same time, government says that there's no money for like healthcare, education, or social protection, and it's exactly what you pointed earlier. That's why Oxfam, we've been pushing for taxing the super rich conversation, because we know that money exists. It just concentrates at the top. It doesn't go back to the economy.
Amir, some economists have warned that the sort of aggressive taxation on ultra wealthy could drive business or capital away. Where do we find the balancing act? Because the reason I'm asking this is that Team South Africa right now is in Davos to try and, of course, get more foreign investment into the country. And I had a conversation with Brand South Africa yesterday, and there seems to be this confidence that it could happen. But where does this balance start from? Because yes, it's great to have this foreign investment, but to what end?
For us, it's so funny you ask these questions, because I feel like that argument comes up every time, and history tells us it's overstated over and over again. Many of the world's most stable and prosperous economies grew during periods when the wealthy were taxed far more than they are now. So what really matters is fair, coordinated policy, especially cooperations between countries to close loopholes. Extreme inequality isn't good for business either. It creates instability, social tensions, and weak demands. And like one final thing I really want to touch on is that Oxfam, alongside our sister organization, the Patriotic Millionaires, we did a research here in South Africa, with a survey, and 70% of South African billionaires, South African US dollar millionaires, 70% of them agreed to further taxation for a more equal society. So this argument, I feel like, is one of those media frenzy talking points that is always used as a counter argument, but honestly, history shows us otherwise.
Okay, so I mean, you use that, of course, the patriotic millionaires, and that's quite an important report. So, from a South African perspective, I mean, based on what you're saying right now, we shouldn't have a problem in this country. I mean, 70% is quite a large amount.
Yeah, it is. And that's what I say. It is fundamentally important to listen to majority of people and not necessarily the fundamental, individuals that have enormous amount of political influence with finance or with funds. And I think once we are honest enough to have those kinds of conversation in the name of true economic, socioeconomic development, then we would truly be in a far greater place and environment for the greater good of the people than we are today.
Amir, part of this report also linked wealth and concentration to the rollback of civil liberties and restrictions on freedoms of association and expression. I guess majority of the world has a democratic outlook. There are constitutions that, of course, govern how the country is run, and in many of them, freedom of expression, association, the allowance of civil liberties is there for the citizens of their respective countries. How real and widespread is this sort of threat that when you have wealth, and if they are in a position of power, this can be suppressed?
Yeah, it's a very real threat, and we are already living with it. It's not something that we are anticipating. It's something that we are already living in it. As inequality raises, frustration grows, and instead of addressing the root cause, some governments respond by limiting protest or silencing civil society or restricting freedom of expression. And the report shows that democratic freedoms have been declining globally, not just in one particular region, but globally for years now. So inequality isn't just economic issue; it's a human rights issue. And I think, the report I was reading, this is 2025 was the 19th consecutive year of democracy and democratic values being eroding globally. And that should really be a good wake-up call,
With that said, Amir, the world's leaders, the best businessmen, the wealthiest businessmen are in Davos at this moment. Would they be looking at this report, Amir, and saying, well, you know what, let's try and find an equal world for all of us? Or, like we've mentioned throughout this conversation, a capitalist would be a capitalist and their interest would be that of profit making. What is the hope from Oxfam, especially from an Oxfam South Africa perspective, as the World Economic Forum takes place?
Yeah, I think it's just for us to remind decision makers and, everybody, even ordinary citizens, the people that are concerned about their day-to-day activities, that the biggest obstacle is not a matter of, technicalities. It's a political issue. We know what works, which is progressive taxation, strong public services, transparency, and fair labor policies. And what blocks these reforms is pressure from powerful interests that benefit from the status quo, whether it's lobbying, political influence, or sometimes fear-mongering about economic collapse. But public support for change is growing, and governments need to listen. I think this is the right time to listen. And just in closing, if I may say,
Sure.
at the end of the day, this isn't about punishing success. It's about choosing a system that works for many, not just the few on top. And that's all we have to remember.
Yeah, no, of course. And I don't want to touch again on the high taxes on the extreme wealth because we have elaborated on it throughout this conversation. But a part of the report, as a final question, Amir, is the calls for a national inequality reduction plans. How practical is this, Amir, and how can this be done, starting, of course, from a South African perspective and then implementing it globally?
Yeah, I think, it is very practical.
Mm,
As you know, in South Africa, we have dozens of commissions investigating many, aspects of
sure.
political, a crisis in this country. So having a body or having a desk within government that focuses on these issues would be fundamentally different. And this conversation, again, is not necessarily a new conversation.
Mm,
Even, during the time of G20, when we looked at, the global inequality
mm,
report that was provided to, the South African president, it was highlighted that now more than ever is the time to have a, global institution that focuses on global inequality.
mm.
And these are conversations that we need to have because they will fundamentally shape the way in which we plan for a future that is more equal, and not a future that is constantly threatened by wealth holders who want to have influence over every aspect of our life.
Amir, always good having you on. Shukran for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. Wa alaikum salam.
That's Amir Baghari Romi, who is the Media and Campaign Officer at Oxfam South Africa. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. If you've missed today's episode, you'll be able to find it on our YouTube channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.